Some stories don't just leave you speechless, they reach deep into your soul and stir emotions you didn't know were there. This is one of those stories, a powerful tale of love, forgiveness, and a bond that time and pain could not destroy. It begins in a quiet family courtroom, the kind of place where routine matters like custody disputes and juvenile offenses are addressed without much attention. But on this particular morning, something felt different, like the air itself carried a quiet tension that everyone sensed but couldn't explain. At the center of it all was Judge Rebecca Hart, a woman known for her sharp discipline, her unwavering sense of justice, and her no-nonsense approach to every case that crossed her bench. She was respected, even feared, for the authority she carried with her every time she entered the room. Her black robe flowing with purpose, her eyes sharp and attentive like a hawk surveying its domain. She had no patience for excuses, especially not from the troubled youth she frequently encountered. But on this day, seated across from her at the defendant's table, was a young girl who seemed too small for such a serious setting. Her name was Leela, just 12 years old. Leela's fragile frame was nearly swallowed by the towering wooden chair she sat in. She wore scuffed sneakers, jeans that had grown too short, and a hoodie that had clearly seen better days. But more than her appearance, it was her eyes that drew attention, eyes that carried a strength no child should need to possess. The kind of silent resilience forged by years of instability and unanswered questions. Yet, behind that strength was something else, a flicker of uncertainty, a quiet anticipation, like she was standing in the eye of a storm that was only just beginning. Leela had been arrested after being found trespassing in a gated community. When the police confronted her, she couldn't explain why she was there. On the surface, it was just another juvenile case to move through the system, the kind Judge Hart had seen 100 times. But when the bailiff called the room to attention and announced the arrival of the Honorable Judge Hart, and Rebecca stepped in with her usual commanding presence, something intangible shifted. The courtroom stood in unison, the soft shuffle of feet and the creaking of benches creating a background hum as everyone prepared for yet another proceeding. Rebecca sat down, her gaze briefly meeting Leela's, a connection so fleeting it could have gone unnoticed, but something about it lingered. As Rebecca glanced down at the file before her, her voice rang out, calm and precise, asking Leela the question she asked dozens of times every week. How do you plead, guilty or not guilty? And then everything changed. The courtroom, which had already been unusually quiet, grew even more still, like the moment before a storm hits. Leela sat frozen, gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles, her chest rising and falling with each anxious breath. Slowly, she stood up, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Her voice, when it came, was louder and steadier than anyone expected. Not guilty, she said, but before anyone could react, she took another breath and added something that would shatter the silence like glass. Because you're my mom. The words sliced through the courtroom like a blade. The entire room froze. Gasps echoed around her. The prosecutor, the stenographer, the spectators, every person in that room stopped cold. Rebecca Hart, the judge known for her composure, suddenly looked like a statue. Her pen hung in midair, her hand trembling. She couldn't speak. Her past, so carefully buried for decades, had just walked into her courtroom and spoken out loud the one truth she had never dared to confront. Leela's voice, full of hurt and raw truth, continued, accusing her of giving her away and not even recognizing her now. The weight of that accusation pressed down on everyone present. And yet, in that moment, it wasn't just about a child and a judge. It was about a mother and daughter, two people bound by blood and separated by fear, shame, and years of silence. The truth had been revealed, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the courtroom sat frozen in disbelief, the silence was so complete it felt like time had stopped. Judge Rebecca Hart, a woman who had built her entire life around logic, control, and unwavering professionalism, found herself paralyzed. Her hand hovered over the pen she had been holding, her composure slipping for the first time in years. Across the courtroom, Leela remained standing, her voice steady yet trembling with pain. confronting the woman who had given birth to her and then walked away. "You gave me away," Leela said, her voice cracking under the weight of her own words, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And now you don't even recognize me." The words sliced into Rebecca, tearing through the protective walls she had spent decades constructing. Every breath she took felt heavier, as if the weight of her past had finally come to collect its due. The courtroom remained completely still, with no one daring to move, as though even the air itself was holding its breath. The prosecutor, recovering from his shock, stood and attempted to redirect the focus. His voice rang out with cold precision as he reminded the court that this was not Leela's first run-in with the law, mentioning prior instances of trespassing and loitering. Though no charges had been filed at the time, to him, she was a repeat offender, a troubled youth who needed discipline, not sympathy. Leela remained quiet, her fingers nervously twisting at the hem of her hoodie, her head bowed under the weight of judgment, until her defense attorney, a weary but kind-hearted public defender, stood up. His voice was calm but resolute as he painted a different picture, one of a child with no home, no stability, no safety net. He reminded the court that Leela wasn't acting out of malice but desperation. That what she needed wasn't punishment, but help. "She has no one," he said, his voice softening, "and yet she has managed to hold on to hope. That should count for something." He glanced at Leela, and for a moment, she lifted her eyes, their shared gaze a small but powerful exchange of strength. Rebecca's heart pounded. The words, "because you're my mom," echoed endlessly in her mind. Her instincts told her to dismiss the outburst, to return to order, to regain control, but something deeper, more human, stopped her. She looked at Leela again, this time really looking, and in those eyes, she saw it. Not just pain, not just accusation, but something much more fragile, hope. When she finally responded, her voice was colder than she intended, clipped and defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about." It was a reflex, a denial, a shield, but the room had already changed. Reporters in the back whispered frantically, scribbling notes and murmuring disbelief. The whispers grew, a wave of tension spreading across the room. Every eye turned toward the judge. Once the symbol of stoic control, now visibly rattled. In the back of the room, Gloria Adams, the social worker assigned to Leela's case, watched the interaction with quiet intensity. She had seen far too many children lost in the cracks of a broken system. Their needs ignored, their voices silenced. And now, she saw something different, an opening. A sliver of possibility that this case might not end like all the others. Leela sat motionless, her hands clenched into fists, her shoulders tight, but her eyes never left Rebecca's. Her gaze was unwavering, piercing through the judge's mask. Rebecca banged her gavel for order, but her voice lacked the strength it once had. The courtroom quieted, but the weight of the moment lingered heavily in the air. Rebecca pretended to read the file in front of her, but the words blurred into nothing. Her mind raced, her chest tightening with guilt and confusion. Then, from across the room, Leela's voice rose again, softer now, but no less powerful. "I've been through so many foster homes," she began, her words trembling with emotion. "Every time I moved, I thought maybe this time it would be different. Maybe this family would keep me. Maybe my real mom would come for me." The room, once again, was silent, an almost sacred quiet, as if everyone in it understood that something sacred was happening. "But you didn't come," Leela continued, louder this time. "You never came. You didn't even try." Rebecca's hands gripped the edge of the bench. Her gaze fell, unable to meet Leela's, the shame in her chest rising like a tide. "All I ever wanted," Leela said, her voice nearly a whisper, "was to know why. Why did you leave me? Was I not enough? Was I not worth it?" The words struck like thunder, raw and real. Rebecca felt her walls finally start to crumble. She had spent years justifying her decision to give Leela up. At 18, she had felt trapped, her parents adamant that motherhood would destroy her future. She had surrendered Leela in hopes that her daughter would have a better life. But now, seeing this brave child stand in front of her, She realized she had made a choice that scarred them both. And that scar had never healed. Leela took one step closer. Her voice now calm but unshakable. "I just wanted you to try," she said, "just once." Her words lingered, hanging in the thick air of the courtroom like a truth no one could deny. Rebecca sat frozen, the weight of motherhood, regret, and truth pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. The silence that followed was not just about what had been said, but about what it meant, the unraveling of secrets, the confrontation of guilt, and the undeniable need for healing. And in that silence, something powerful took root, not judgment, not anger, but a small flicker of something new, the beginning of redemption. Rebecca sat alone in her chambers. The heavy oak door closed behind her, casting the room in a stillness that contrasted sharply with the emotional storm that had erupted in the courtroom just moments ago. The silence was not comforting. It was suffocating, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk as if anchoring herself to something solid in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. Leela's voice echoed in her ears. "Why didn't you come? Was I not enough?" And no matter how tightly she tried to shut the door on those words, they broke through every wall she had ever built. She closed her eyes, and the memories she had buried so deeply clawed their way back to the surface. She was 18 again, standing in her parents' living room, the air thick with disapproval and disappointment. Her father's voice had been cold, furious, accusing her of ruining her future. Her mother, once a gentle presence in her life, sat silently, her face pale with shame as she whispered, "This is for the best. You're too young. You can't raise a child." Rebecca had wanted to believe she could be a good mother despite everything. Despite the fear, the pressure, the looming expectations of school and career. She had wrapped her arms around her stomach, trying to protect the fragile hope growing inside her. But eventually, that hope had been crushed beneath the weight of her parents' insistence, of society's judgment, of her own crippling fear. A week later, she had signed the papers. She still remembered the feel of Leela's tiny fingers wrapping around her thumb, so small, so full of life, and the way they had clung to her. Unknowingly, as she handed her baby over to the social worker, it was a memory that had never truly faded. No matter how many verdicts she had delivered, how many cases she had closed, how many titles and accolades she had earned, she had spent years convincing herself she had done the right thing. That Leela would be better off. That she would find a family who could give her what Rebecca couldn't. And maybe for a time, those lies had been enough to keep her going. But not anymore, not after looking into the eyes of the girl she had once given away, the same eyes now staring back at her across a courtroom, filled with pain and questions that demanded answers. A soft but deliberate knock broke through her thoughts. She didn't respond immediately, hoping the silence would send the visitor away. But the knock came again, firmer this time. "Come in," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The door opened to reveal Gloria Adams, Leela's social worker, her expression calm yet resolute. She stepped into the room, closing the door gently behind her, a folder tucked under one arm. "Judge Hart," she began, "do you have a moment?" Rebecca straightened in her chair, attempting to regain her composure with the mask she wore so well. "What can I do for you, Ms. Adams?" Gloria hesitated, then placed the folder on Rebecca's desk. But she didn't open it. Instead, she sat across from her, folding her hands carefully. "It's about Leela," she said gently. Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she nodded slightly, bracing herself. "She's been in the system her whole life," Gloria continued. "Foster homes, temporary guardianships, shelters. Some were kind, some were not, but through all of it, she's held on to one thing: hope." Rebecca's eyes flicked toward the folder but didn't open it. Her fingers tensed. "She's been drawing," Gloria said softly. "Hundreds of pictures, all of them about one thing: a mother she's never met." Slowly, Gloria opened the folder and turned it toward Rebecca. Inside were pages filled with drawings, some messy and childlike, others more refined, But every one of them shared a common theme: a woman with gentle eyes and open arms. A mother imagined from longing and need. Rebecca stared at them, her breath catching. "She just wants to know you," Gloria whispered. "That's all she's ever wanted." The drawings struck her harder than any words ever could. Each stroke, each line, carried a longing so raw it made her chest ache. Gloria let the silence hang, then said something that cut through everything. "You spent your life giving others justice. What about her?" Rebecca's voice cracked when she finally spoke. "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is," Gloria replied, her tone kind but firm. "She found you. That's more than most kids like her ever get. Don't waste this chance." Rebecca's defenses began to crumble. She had told herself she was protecting Leela by staying away. But deep down, she knew she had been protecting herself from guilt, from judgment, from fear. Gloria stood and headed for the door. "She's waiting," she said, "but she won't wait forever." When she left, Rebecca sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the drawings, the edges of her vision blurred by unshed tears. One showed a faceless woman, drawn in frantic, desperate strokes. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Her daughter didn't even know what she looked like. All these years, she had hidden behind her robe, behind her title, behind the illusion of control. She had told herself her work made up for her past. But no success, no respect, no courtroom win could erase the ache in her chest. Slowly, she reached out, touching one of the drawings, a mother holding a child in a warm embrace. It was everything Leela had dreamed of, everything Rebecca had failed to be. But now, she had a choice. The past couldn't be rewritten, but the future wasn't set in stone. With trembling hands, she picked up the folder and held it close to her chest. It wasn't just paper and ink, it was her daughter's heart, laid bare in color and line. She stood, her movements slow but purposeful. For the first time in years, she felt something more powerful than fear: hope. With a steadying breath, she walked to the door and opened it. The hallway stretched out before her, quiet, uncertain, but she took that first step anyway. Not as a judge, but as a mother. The courtroom was thick with anticipation. Every eye fixed on Judge Rebecca Hart and the small girl who had just shattered the silence with a truth no one could ignore. Leela sat at the defendant's table, her tiny frame rigid with a strength far beyond her years, her hands tightly gripping the edge as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Rebecca tried to focus on the file before her, but the words blurred together, meaningless against the thunderstorm of emotion rising within her. Leela's earlier words echoed mercilessly in her mind. "Why didn't you try to find me?" Cutting through every defense she had built. The air in the room grew heavier as Leela stood again, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that felt like a blade through tension. Her voice, though trembling, carried a quiet fire. "If you don't want me," she said, her eyes locked on Rebecca, "then just say it, right here, right now." A low murmur spread across the gallery, then died as quickly as it rose, leaving the room suspended in stillness once again. Leela took a step forward, and though her hands shook, her voice grew clearer with every syllable. "But if you ever thought about me, if you ever wondered what happened to me, then why didn't you come? Why didn't you try to find me?" The words landed like thunderclaps, sharp and painful, breaking open wounds long buried. Even the reporters, their pens midair, seemed unable to move, caught in the intensity of the moment. Rebecca looked up, her eyes meeting Leela's for the first time since that haunting declaration. There was no anger in the girl's gaze now, only sorrow. And a desperate, aching need for the truth. Rebecca's throat tightened. She wanted to respond, to explain, to deny, but every rehearsed excuse felt hollow now, lifeless. Leela's voice softened but didn't lose its strength. "You had a choice," she said, "and you chose to leave me behind. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To wonder, every day, if I wasn't good enough for you to stay?" A soft gasp rose from somewhere in the gallery, a breath caught in the throat of someone who had been trying not to cry. Rebecca's hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. But still, she said nothing. The silence was thick, unbearable, But Leela didn't stop. "I just want the truth," she whispered, "because I can't keep wondering anymore." Rebecca's mask of composure was breaking. For years, she had convinced herself she had made the right decision, letting Leela go so she could have a better life. But now, looking at this brave, hurting child standing before her, that belief felt like a cruel lie. Gloria Adams watched from the back of the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly, praying for Rebecca to finally speak. She could see it, the war raging behind the judge's eyes, the years of guilt crashing against the armor of silence. Leela's final words dropped into the stillness like stones. "I'm standing here, asking you for the truth. Don't let me walk away with nothing again." The courtroom seemed to freeze once more, the air charged with unspoken longing. Rebecca sat still for a long moment, her breath shallow, her chest tight. Then, slowly, she stood. Her commanding presence, once so unshakable, now felt fragile, human. She looked at Leela, her lips trembling, and when she spoke, her voice broke. "I was wrong," she said, barely above a whisper. "I was so wrong." The room fell completely silent again. "I was scared," Rebecca continued, her voice cracking. "I was just 18. I didn't know how to be a mother. Everyone around me said it was the right thing to do, to give you up, so you could have a better life." Her eyes welled with tears as she looked at Leela, no longer as a judge, but as a woman stripped bare by truth. But they were wrong. I was wrong. The people in the gallery, once skeptics or spectators, now listened in reverent quiet, many wiping tears from their eyes. "I told myself staying away would protect you," Rebecca went on, "that it was better for you not to know me. But the truth is, I was protecting myself, from shame, from regret, from fear." The tears she had held back for years now flowed freely down her face. "I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a single day. And I'm sorry, so sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough. Because you were. You are." Leela stood still, tears brimming but not yet falling. Her hands trembled slightly, but her expression softened. The courtroom, once a battleground of pain, now held its breath in a moment of silent hope. Rebecca's voice grew steadier. "If you can ever forgive me, Leela, I want to try. I want to be the mother you deserved." Leela's lips quivered, and her voice was barely audible as she whispered, "I just wanted you to say it." A wave of emotion swept through the room, hushed gasps and soft sobs rising as the weight of that moment settled over them all. Gloria smiled from the back, her hands pressed tightly together in quiet relief. Rebecca and Leela's eyes remained locked, and for the first time in years, Rebecca felt something she hadn't known she still had: hope. The courtroom lights dimmed slowly as the day came to a close. But the echoes of what had just unfolded lingered. Rebecca stepped into the hallway beyond the courtroom, and ahead of her, Leela walked with quiet strength. Rebecca hesitated for just a moment before calling out, her voice soft, unsure. "Leela." The girl turned, her eyes still wet with tears. "I want to try," Rebecca said. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be there now. If you'll let me." Leela stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for sincerity. Then, slowly, she nodded. In the days and weeks that followed the emotional breakthrough in the courtroom, Rebecca Hart began to dismantle the carefully constructed world she had spent a lifetime building. Trading the rigid order of her judicial career for the uncertain and emotional journey of becoming a mother again, not in title, but in presence. She took the first and most difficult step by filing a formal petition for legal guardianship of Leela. Knowing full well that the process would take time, that it would be scrutinized and questioned by a system she had once enforced with strict authority. But this time, Rebecca was not acting as a judge or a symbol of justice. She was simply a woman trying to mend the broken bridge between her and the daughter she had left behind. More than the legal motions, she committed herself to showing up, consistently, wholeheartedly, and without conditions. Her gestures began small, almost tentative, as she and Leela started meeting once a week at a modest little diner tucked away near Leela's group home. It was Leela's favorite spot, familiar, safe, with booths that absorbed secrets and jukebox tunes that didn't ask questions. They sat across from each other sharing milkshakes, French fries, and slowly, fragments of themselves. Rebecca learned that Leela liked strawberry more than chocolate, that she hated onions, that she doodled absent-mindedly on napkins when she was nervous, and that sometimes silence was more meaningful than forced conversation. Leela, in turn, began to let her guard down, not all at once, but like the thawing of frost, bit by bit. Almost imperceptibly, but undeniably, there were still moments of hesitation. Quiet walls Leela hadn't torn down yet. But Rebecca didn't push, she simply remained. One day led to the next. And slowly, a rhythm formed, one built not from shared history, but from present effort. When Leela's first art showcase was announced at the local community center, Rebecca attended without hesitation. Her heart pounded as she entered the room filled with strangers, feeling more exposed than she ever had in a courtroom. On the walls hung Leela's work, sketches, paintings, and mixed media pieces, many of them displaying a recurring theme, a faceless mother figure. Always reaching out, always loving, always absent. Rebecca felt her chest tighten with every image, recognizing them as windows into years of longing and unanswered questions. These drawings were once Leela's private world, silent expressions of dreams and disappointments, but now they were out in the open, shared with the world, raw and real. When Leela stepped onto the small stage to thank the guests, her eyes scanned the crowd until they found Rebecca. For a brief, electrifying moment, their gazes locked. Leela smiled, a small, hesitant curve of her lips, but one that carried the weight of hope and tentative trust. Rebecca's eyes blurred with tears as she clapped, her hands trembling. She had delivered countless verdicts over the years, but this moment, bearing silent witness to her daughter's strength and talent, was the most profound judgment of her life. Rebecca didn't stop there, determined to know her daughter beyond the courtroom and beyond her guilt. She dedicated herself to understanding Leela, her fears, her joys, her quiet habits. They started taking short walks together in the park, playing board games, and listening to music. Rebecca even began sketching with her, terribly, comically, but Leela laughed. And that laughter felt like redemption. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when Leela recoiled, when past wounds reopened with the slightest trigger, a missed text, a delayed visit, an accidental comment. But Rebecca never retreated. She stayed, listened, apologized, and kept showing up. Each act of patience became a brick in the bridge they were rebuilding. One afternoon, at the closing of the gallery showcase, Rebecca stood quietly in a corner, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on one particular painting hung at the far end. It stood out from the rest, a canvas bathed in warm golden hues, depicting a mother and child in a gentle embrace, their faces serene, their bodies leaning into each other as if the world outside didn't exist. It radiated peace, safety, love. Rebecca felt her breath catch as she slowly approached it. She stood in front of the painting, her hands clasped in front of her, her heart thundering in her chest. Every detail in the artwork seemed to echo a dream, a wish Leela had carried in her heart for years. Then, Leela appeared beside her, quiet and composed, her hands slightly trembling. "I made this one for you," she said softly, almost afraid of the words. Rebecca turned toward her, her voice cracking. "For me?" Leela nodded, her eyes filled with that same vulnerable strength that had stunned the courtroom weeks ago. "I drew it because I always hoped," she whispered. "I hoped that one day you'd come back, that you'd want me." Rebecca was speechless. The painting, with all its color and tenderness, represented everything Leela had ever longed for, and everything Rebecca had once been too afraid to offer. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned back to the canvas, seeing not just a beautiful piece of art, but a sacred message of hope kept alive through pain. Finally, she turned fully to Leela, her voice heavy with emotion. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I should have been there. I should never have let you go." Leela's lips quivered. For a moment, Rebecca feared she might turn away, but instead, the girl stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her. It was not a hesitant hug. It was firm, full, and overflowing with all the words they had never said. Rebecca dropped to her knees, holding her daughter tightly, burying her face in Leela's shoulder as tears flowed freely. "I'm here now," she whispered, "and I'm never letting you go again." The world around them faded. The chatter, the footsteps, the noise, it all melted into silence as mother and daughter finally embraced, not just with their bodies, but with their hearts. When they finally pulled apart, Rebecca cupped Leela's face in her hands, gently wiping the tears from her cheeks. "You've always been my daughter," she said, her voice unwavering, "and you always will be." Leela smiled again, this time with less fear, more certainty, and reached out to hold Rebecca's hand, squeezing it tightly as if anchoring herself to something she never wanted to lose again. As the gallery slowly emptied and the crowd dispersed into the quiet evening, Rebecca and Leela remained seated on a bench near the painting that had come to symbolize their journey, a portrait of a mother and child, surrounded by soft golden hues, forever leaning into one another in a world untouched by pain. The warmth of the room lingered, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the emotion of the day and were reluctant to let it go. Rebecca sat silently beside her daughter, her hands still wrapped around Leela's, her heart a whirlwind of gratitude, sorrow, and resolve. She turned to look at Leela, who had leaned gently against her shoulder, her eyes tired but calm, her presence a quiet reassurance that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. Rebecca took a deep breath and spoke with a softness that hadn't been present in her voice in years. "You've taught me something I never thought I'd learn," she said, her words almost carried away by the hum of the quiet room. Leela tilted her head upward slightly, curiosity lighting her expression. "I've spent so much of my life trying to be perfect," Rebecca continued, "trying to control everything, to plan, to perform, to build a life so structured that nothing could go wrong." Her voice trembled slightly, but she pressed on. "But love isn't about control. It's not about perfection. It's about presence. It's about choosing to show up, especially when it's hard." Leela smiled faintly and nodded, resting her head once again on Rebecca's shoulder. In that still, quiet moment, surrounded by the echoes of their pain and the promise of something new, they sat in silence, not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of understanding. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the emotion of it all. She had once believed that motherhood was something you had to be ready for, something earned through preparation, timing, and sacrifice. But here, with Leela beside her, she realized the truth. Motherhood was a series of choices, made every single day, to show up, to listen, to be brave enough to try again. Even when the past feels unforgivable. She had failed at the beginning, but that didn't mean she couldn't try now. That didn't mean she couldn't learn, love, and become the kind of mother Leela had dreamed of in her quiet drawings and whispered hopes. Rebecca glanced down at their intertwined hands and felt a renewed sense of purpose. No courtroom victory, no career milestone, no public recognition could compare to this moment, this bond, this fragile and powerful beginning. She thought of all the years she had spent convincing herself that the past had to stay buried, that the only way forward was to forget. But Leela had done the opposite. Leela had remembered, she had hoped, she had waited, and somehow, through all the rejection, abandonment, and pain, she had never let go of the possibility that love could still find her, that someone could still choose her. And Rebecca knew, with absolute certainty, that she would keep choosing Leela, every single day. Not just when it was easy, but when it was awkward, painful, uncomfortable, when it meant facing shame and regret, when it meant asking for forgiveness again and again. She had lived a life governed by rules, bound by logic and responsibility. But sitting on that bench, holding her daughter's hand, she discovered a deeper truth. Healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about accepting the cracks, the scars, and still choosing to love anyway. As Leela shifted slightly and Rebecca wrapped an arm around her shoulders, a sense of calm settled between them. Outside the windows, the evening light softened into dusk, painting the sky in pastel tones that matched the warmth inside the room. Leela finally spoke, her voice quiet and even. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I didn't think you would." Rebecca turned toward her, brushing a strand of hair from Leela's forehead. "I'm glad I did too," she said. "I'm sorry it took me so long. But I'm here now, and I'm staying." Leela didn't respond with words. But the way she nestled closer said everything. For years, they had lived separate lives, each haunted by the absence of the other. But now, together in this moment, they were beginning something new, something real, something worth fighting for. And as they sat quietly near the painting that had once represented a dream, it now stood as a symbol of their truth, not perfect, not polished, but honest, whole, and full of hope. In the weeks that followed the quiet moment in the gallery, Rebecca committed herself not just to being present, but to truly learning who Leela was, not the imagined version she had held in her mind over the years, but the real, vibrant, complex girl who had stood in front of her and demanded the truth. She started showing up in ways that mattered, not as a judge or a woman trying to atone for the past, but as a mother who finally understood that love is built not through grand gestures, but through small, daily efforts. She learned Leela's favorite songs and kept them on a playlist in her car. She discovered that Leela hated mornings but loved rain, that she collected smooth stones from every place she visited, and that she had a secret stash of letters she had written over the years to the mother she never knew. Addressed but never sent. Rebecca read every one of them, each word like a whisper from a wounded heart. And with every letter, she felt the cracks in her own heart widen, not with regret alone, but with the determination to do better. They began creating new routines together, walking in the park every Saturday morning, watching old animated movies on Friday nights, and sharing late-night pancakes when sleep felt impossible. Rebecca also began attending Leela's school meetings, art events, and even casual parent gatherings that once would have felt foreign and uncomfortable. She introduced herself not with her title, but simply as Leela's mom, and slowly, she saw the way Leela's shoulders began to relax in her presence. The way she began to speak more freely, to laugh more often. The trust, once so fragile, was growing roots. But healing was not a straight line. There were days when the weight of the past crept back in, when Leela would grow quiet, distant, eyes clouded with memories of foster homes that didn't love her, of nights spent wondering why she had been left behind. Rebecca didn't try to fill those silences with explanations. She sat beside her daughter, held her hand, and simply stayed, because she understood now that sometimes love means waiting, sometimes it means being there without needing to fix. And in those quiet moments, a different kind of connection grew, one that didn't require words. One evening, Rebecca surprised Leela with a visit to a small art supply store. The girl's face lit up as she wandered the aisles, her fingers dancing over sketchbooks, charcoal pencils, and tubes of paint. Rebecca watched from a distance, her chest swelling with pride and awe. When Leela chose a new easel and a set of brushes, Rebecca didn't question the cost or the practicality. She simply paid for them with a quiet smile and said, "Create whatever you want. I want to see the world through your eyes." That night, Leela painted for hours, and Rebecca sat nearby, sipping tea and reading, occasionally glancing up just to watch her daughter work. It was a kind of peace she had never known, a life stripped of performance, rooted in presence. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. Leela came home from school carrying a large envelope. Inside was an invitation to an exclusive youth art competition. Her teachers had submitted her work without telling her, and she had been selected as a finalist. The exhibition would be held in a city 2 hours away. Rebecca immediately cleared her schedule. She booked a hotel room, packed snacks for the road, and even borrowed a digital camera from a friend to take pictures of the event. Leela, nervous but excited, held onto her mother's hand the entire drive. At the gallery, her work was displayed alongside dozens of other young artists. But something about Leela's piece drew people in. It was another mother-daughter painting, this one different. More vivid, more detailed. The faces were clear now. The mother had Rebecca's eyes, her smile, the same soft lines that time had etched onto her face. And the daughter was unmistakably Leela. Standing tall, their hands clasped in a grip that seemed unbreakable, when the announcer called her name as one of the top 3 winners. Rebecca could hardly breathe. She clapped so hard her hands ached. Leela accepted her ribbon with a quiet pride. And when she turned to look at Rebecca, her eyes shimmered, not just with joy, but with certainty. Later that night, as they sat in the hotel room, Leela curled up on the bed, her head resting on her mother's lap. Rebecca stroked her hair gently, remembering the tiny infant she once gave away, and the courageous girl who had found her way back. "Thank you for believing in me," Leela whispered. "Always," Rebecca replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Even before I knew how." That night, as Leela slept peacefully beside her, Rebecca stayed awake, watching her daughter breathe. She knew now that motherhood was not just about biology or names on legal documents. It was about staying when it's hard. It was about listening, learning, and never giving up, even when you feel you've failed too many times. She had missed so many firsts in Leela's life, her first steps, her first words, her first heartbreak, but she was here now for the moments that mattered just as much. The first time Leela called her Mom without hesitation. The first time they laughed until they cried. The first time they danced in the kitchen to old songs. And in those moments, Rebecca felt something she never thought she'd have again. A sense of purpose, of joy, of home. Not the kind with walls and ceilings, but the kind made of connection and love. As she drifted off to sleep beside her daughter, her heart full, she understood one simple truth: redemption doesn't come from erasing the past. It comes from showing up today, and every day after, with love, humility, and the willingness to try. The gallery buzzed softly with the sounds of admiration, low murmurs, quiet gasps, the occasional whispered conversation as visitors moved from one piece of art to the next, taking in the emotions so vividly captured on canvas. Rebecca stood quietly among them, her gaze drifting slowly from frame to frame, watching people absorb Leela's work. She saw how some paused longer at certain images, especially the ones of the faceless mothers. The reaching hands, the quiet longing stitched into every brushstroke. She followed the gentle flow of the crowd until her eyes landed on a single painting displayed at the far end of the room. It stood slightly apart from the others, framed in soft light that gave it an almost sacred glow. This painting was different. The mother's face was no longer hidden or imagined. It was unmistakably Rebecca, her eyes, her smile, the lines of age and quiet strength lovingly detailed in warm, welcoming colors. She stood in the painting with arms wrapped protectively around a child,